Perfect. And just turn it off when you're done. If you don't have to do anything. It should be, and then I'll just process the video. Good luck.
No one submitted it. I'm so sure. Yeah, no one submitted it. It had a really good chili. It had.
Having this
Awesome. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Emily Yeager's dissertation defense. Thank y'all for coming. It's an exciting day both for Emily and myself. This is my first PhD student, so I feel like I'm defending in a way as well. So it's like the pressure's both on a little bit. But I just want to talk about how awesome Emily's been as a PhD student. Some things that you may not know is that she's part of the Warrenell PhD program as well as the Joint Integrative Conservation PhD program, a very rigorous PhD program. She's been very productive here at Georgia. She has 4 co-authored journal articles, a book chapter, and has had 10 academic conferences, presentations. What's also great about her dissertation study is that it wasn't one that was just given over to her like, hey, here's everything, go do it. Emily's actually raised about $10,000 through various awards and grants to actually fund this research here. And as you'll see, she walked 300 miles as part of her data collection. So I bet that's something that most of y'all can't say. And Emily has recently had a job at East Carolina as an assistant professor. So she's had the really hard task of being one foot in the door of a job and finishing this up at the same time. So let's give it a round of applause for Emily. And
oh, wow, that was an awesome introduction. Thank you so much. And before I start today, I actually want to introduce everybody in the room to the committee members here that have helped me get to where I am now. So this is my chair, Dr. Bynum Boley. He's from Warrenell in our PRTM program now, newly named. This is Meredith Welch-Devine from the graduate school / anthropology, correct?
Yes, more or less.
More or less, and also icon. So she's everything. And then we have Dr. Gary Green. He is also here in the PRTM program at Warrenell. And we have Dr. Carrie Goches, and she is from the Department of Historic Preservation, which is in the College of Planning and
Environment and Design.
And then we have Dr. Kyle Wisdom, who is here in the PRTM program as well. So thank you to each of you for being here today and all of the help you've provided me so far. And thank you to all of you who are here today. So today I'm going to be talking to you about my dissertation work, which essentially was trying to understand how we could assess the impacts of short-term vacation rentals in urban landscapes. Oh, we were going to do that. Hang on.
I've got a backup one if you need it.
Well, it was working like 2 minutes ago.
Sorry, I wasn't that guy, right?
Everybody's got a guy, right?
we got a backup. Ready.
Okay, I'm sorry. This was working like a minute ago.
They're totally informal here, so just do what you got to do.
So I'm going to get to exit it and go back into it.
Yeah. For it to acknowledge.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll try it.
Here we go. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so first I'm going to introduce you to sort of what I'm talking about when I'm saying short-term vacation rentals, and then I'll move into talking about the first article in this dissertation, which was really trying to create a conceptual model on how we can understand how these impacts occur in urban landscapes from short-term vacation rentals and where they occur. And then I'll move into the second article, which is actually trying to operationalize a piece of that model, which is measuring residents' attitudes towards STVRs. And then I'll move into the third article, which was trying to understand a specific type of resident in the urban landscape, which is the host, those who operate these short-term vacation rentals. And then I'll talk about the necessary interdisciplinary approach that it took to make this research happen. And then I'll talk about a research agenda that I now have based off of this project. So when I'm talking about STVRs, I'm talking about short-term vacation rentals, and they fit into this larger sharing economy. And the goal of the sharing economy is to reduce waste in all processes of production and consumption. So you're using extra products or spaces or even skills that you have in this marketplace. And these exchanges vary based on what product we're talking about or even if money is exchanged. But in this case, shared lodging or short-term vacation rentals refers to sharing your home or using an extra space in your home for monetary gain. And you might be familiar with companies like Airbnb, VRBO, FlipKey, or even HomeAway. All of these would fall into this category of short-term vacation rentals. So short-term vacation rentals have grown in popularity since 2008. They've always existed. Lear in 2015 explains people have always been sharing their homes, but these sophisticated platforms in which people are doing it has really just happened over the past 10 years. For instance, Airbnb in particular now boasts over 1.5 million listings in over 190 countries. That's fairly impressive, and they still maintain the status as a unicorn company, meaning they're privately owned and valued over $1 billion. But why do they gain this popularity? Well, it's because they're occurring in urban areas. And Davidson and Franca in 2016 explained that these type of activities would be what we would call disruptive innovations. Okay, but why are we focusing on them occurring in urban landscapes? Well, some of you may be familiar with the statistic that by 2050, 66% of our world's population is expected to be living in urban areas, and North America has already reached 84%. So as people are engaging in this urban migration, there's concerns that are raised about the intensification of consumption and production. So we're looking for ways that can be alternative to the current processes that we have in Western parts of the world, including US cities. Now, when we want to think about, okay, what can short-term vacation rentals offer to be able to be a sustainable pathway in urban areas? We can think about their impacts through Elkington's 2004 triple bottom line, which would think about the economic, the social, and environmental impacts of an activity. Currently, in literature, there is no conceptualization for this. Actually, research is fairly disparate. We see that in 2014, therapists have now began to talk about the economic impacts of STVRs on the accommodation sector, okay? But from a social perspective in 2014, we had Edelman and Luca talking about racial discrimination that was facilitated on these online platforms. And there's still yet to be any research that actually tries to measure the environmental trade-offs of short-term vacation rentals or the sharing economy in general with other types of production and consumption processes. The research also that's been addressing short-term vacation rentals can really be understood from the stakeholders that they've addressed. So we have the traditional accommodation sector, we have STVR guests and hosts, but the stakeholder that has been the least studied is the non-host resident, which is interesting considering that residents are known, according to Sharpley in 2000 and many others that have come afterwards, that residents are the key to sustainable tourism development. And there's two reasons that they serve as sort of that important keystone for that. One is that residents exist on this sort of grassroots level, okay? So they live in these places every single day where they would experience the impacts of short-term vacation rentals. Also, when you're thinking about residents supporting short-term vacation rentals, you would be interested in knowing what is affecting their support. The reason for this is because many municipalities are now enjoying the additional revenue stream that comes from STVRs. So in order to be able to maintain that revenue stream, you would want your residents to continue supporting this activity. So this research, this whole project was really focusing on the resident as sort of this key stakeholder that would serve as not only a baseline to creating sort of this model of how we can understand STVR impacts, but also as an important stakeholder in being able to continue this additional revenue stream in these destinations. So I did this research in Savannah, Georgia, because they were the first city in Georgia to formally regulate STVRs. And before I did this research, the debate was ongoing in Savannah since probably around 2011. That's when the first sort of news articles were coming out about this issue. And it seemed like a very interesting place of contention where regulations were being made essentially on the fly and residents were speaking out in many different online platforms, in public forums, and many of them were not happy with the way that STVRs were currently being managed. So specifically, my research was looking at where STVRs are legally allowed in Savannah. So this is a density map that comes from Savannah in 2017. I double checked and this is still accurate today. They haven't updated this map, but you can see that it begins with the historic landmark district. So for those who are not familiar with Savannah, the city begins right up here at the river. This is the Savannah River. And as you head south, you enter into the Victorian district, and then we enter into the Mid-City district. And the density of STVRs decreases as you headed south, but the regulations also increase. And much of that is because of the concentration of residential areas in the southern zone. And this is really important for where I'm going to take you next. So as I mentioned, I really wanted to be able to create this, this conceptual model of how we could understand the impacts of short-term vacation rentals in destinations, because it was a gap that we currently have in the literature. To do this, I was first taking a landscape approach, okay? So sort of zooming out and thinking about what are all of the elements of the urban landscape that could be affecting, like exacerbating STVR impacts, but what are STVR impacts also helping ameliorate in these urban areas? Landscapes are a great way to think about impacts of a given activity because they're multi-scalar and they have flexible borders. So they could be nested within each other, and also they can take on different meanings. So Sauer in 1925 talks about physical landscapes, but then we have Massey in 2010 explaining they can be ideological in nature. Because of that, we also see other work like Jackson in 2008 talking about cultural landscapes. So there's a lot of diversity and flexibility from this landscape approach. Also, landscapes maintain temporal dynamism. What I mean by that is that we can actually look at historical iterations of that landscape as well as current ones to be able to predict where that landscape would go in the future. So with this approach, I was thinking about how could I conceptualize what is happening in these residential areas? Why would this contention be developing in places such as Savannah? So if we think back to McCannell's work from the 1970s, traditionally, tourism was demarcated to what I'm talking about here is the tourism landscape, but he was calling it as the front stage. So where tourism is being performed. Okay, the backstage area is what would we know as the residential landscape. It's where residents can escape from all of this tourism activity, and it's where tourists are not allowed. The thing with STVRs is that they challenge this notion of strict zones and actually shift the borders and actually sometimes create new shared places, as McCurcher et al. In 2015 explained. And it's the creation of these shared places where access is now be granted to STVR guests that can sometimes create contention. Sometimes the contention can be because of displacement. Okay, so this is a poster that emerged in San Francisco's Chinatown about 2 years ago. And what was happening is that landlords in apartment complexes discovered they can make more money off of Airbnb guests than the current tenants that they had. So they exercised in San Francisco what is known as the Ellis Law. And they essentially declared bankruptcy, evicted all their tenants, and then opened back up as Airbnb hotels. And what that did is it displaced immigrant Chinese, low-income immigrant Chinese that depended upon this affordable housing, but also depended upon this cultural enclave where they could assimilate into the US a little bit better. And this poster here features CEOs of sharing economy companies with their heads impaled on spikes. But not every reaction is negative. Okay, this is a rally in New York City in 2017 with community members supporting Airbnb and other STVR companies. And you see here, probably from this poster here, that one of the reasons that they may have to support STVRs in their community is because they believe that these guests are willing to patron small businesses and have a greater multiplier effect in the community. So the point of showing you these examples is that there could be negative and positive impacts, but currently we don't have a conceptual model that can help us capture what all of those impacts might be. And even more, popular media coverage and academic coverage of these issues tends to focus on the negative impacts. So this is the model that I was using to sort of conceptualize all of these things that were happening in the urban landscape. What this is if you look at the solid line here, this is an adaptation of Butler's 1980 tourism area life cycle model. And the dotted line is an adaptation of Doxey's 1975 Iridex. And what these two models were trying to do was basically show changes in a destination over time as a function of residents' attitudes and the number of STVR guests, seen here on the y-axis. But through this landscape approach, I was proposing that it's not just about the number of guests that are coming to a community, it's also about where they're actually staying, okay? Because for instance, if you were in an STVR in a residential landscape that may have never had tourists before, that could be a totally different type of impact than the different sort of place that may have experienced a level of tourism activity. So as you're following the development of this urban landscape, we think about that temporal dynamism that landscapes hold, which is that then we get to think about future iterations. And when you do that, you actually shift into this systems way of thinking, because we're thinking about the rise and the fall and eventual rise again of a destination. And so at this point here, at the apogee of this model, this is where I was saying you could actually think the most about where STVRs are impacting the urban landscape. And to understand whether that would be a positive or a negative impact, I was using Costanza's idea about ecological system health, thinking about the disruptions in systems don't always have to be negative. They don't have to always be treated as a disease. In fact, they could be treated as an innovation. But the caveat in that is that to actually have this as an innovation, residents have to be able to adapt to these changes that are happening in their community. And I was using Holiday et al.'s 2013 resilience framework to explain just how exactly communities could develop this resilience in the face of this change. So what does this first area of research mean for practitioners? Well, I'm offering a toolkit to think about management and regulation strategies that extend just beyond addressing specific symptoms that they may hear from various stakeholders. Really taking a landscape approach to consider, well, what are all of these environmental, economic, and social impacts that could be happening? What are management strategies that we could take to actually help them be a positive influence in the community? And then from an academic perspective, again, research, there's a gap in the research of looking at sort of this holistic approach of what the impacts of STVRs are and how do they fit into this narrative of urban growth. So the next article is really looking at operationalizing that x-axis of that model. So how do we measure residents' attitudes towards STVRs in a community? To do this, I was taking a quantitative approach through survey methodologies, and I wanted to model all of the antecedents that would be used to predict support for STVRs in a community. And again, remember that's important because they can take political action in the form of their support. They can also behave a certain way towards visitors in a community if they don't support that activity. So it's in the interest of cities to understand what are the antecedents towards resident support. So to start this model, I was using social exchange theory, which was coined by Emerson in 1976, and it's fairly basic. It says that if you feel like you're benefiting from something, you're probably going to support it. And this has been a theory that's used since about 1990 in resident attitude research. And the important thing to remember here is that these are community impacts. As research has advanced with resident attitude research, people were also thinking about the personal cost and benefits that someone might be considering when trying to decide if they'll support something in their community. So in this case, we have personal economic benefits. But the problem with using only social exchange theory in resonant attitude research was critiqued by Woosom et al. In 2008 as saying that social exchange theory had really become sort of this economically biased theory that people were using to understand these costs and benefits that people were considering in their decision-making process. So to combat that bias, Boley et al. In 2014 presented Weber's theory of formal and substantive rationality as a way to recenter sort of that perspective that we were coming from, to consider both the economic and non-economic motivations that someone may have in their decision-making process. So you can think about Weber's theory with the formal rationality as the support for the use of personal economic benefits. The substantive rationality refers to those non-economic factors. So I was using Boley et al.'s resident empowerment through tourism scale to measure those non-economic factors that were affecting their overall support for STVRs. So first is psychological empowerment, which refers to the pride that someone has in their community because of STVRs. Political empowerment refers to the perceived agency that someone has in affecting the regulations surrounding STVRs. And social empowerment refers to the ability of an individual to maintain personal ties with their neighbors or community members, even though STVRs are growing in the community. So overall, the goal was to see, do these antecedents significantly affect residents' overall support for STVRs? To collect this data, I uses a census-guided door-to-door survey. And I did this in the zones as I highlighted earlier, but I highlighted these census tracts here because this is what I was using as for my sampling method. But just to let you know that I didn't survey at the census tract level, I was doing this at the block group level. A total of 600 surveys were distributed. And with this methodology, you would expect between a 60 to 72% response rate. We achieved that with 64% response rate. And the way that the methodology worked is I would knock on a door, and if they accepted the survey, they would leave that on their front porch for me to pick up the next day. That's why I took a GPS point, so that way I could know accurately where to go back to. And if the survey wasn't out there, then I would leave a note like this at their door that kind of explained how they could email, text, or mail in their responses. And actually, respondents took advantage of all three options, which I was very surprised about. So in total, as Vina mentioned, I walked around 304 miles doing this methodology. I was so proud of myself that summer. Can't say I've walked.
Done it in the winter, right?
Yeah, and I also, yes, and I also can't say that I've walked that much in the past year doing writing. But anyway, so moving forward, before you do your structural equation modeling, you need to make sure that there's construct validity within your model. So first I was looking at the convergent validity. So basically, if you were looking at support, I wanted to know, were these items consistently measuring this latent construct for support? Or in other words, if we're thinking about our average variance extracted, can these items explain more than 50% of the variance in responses towards this latent construct of support? So we were looking for statistically significant factor loadings, construct reliability scores above 0.7, and average variance extracted above 0.5, or 50%. And what we see across all of our constructs is actually that those conditions were met. So the next type of construct validity that we were looking for was discriminant validity. So were the constructs distinct enough from one another to be able to run them concurrently in the model? So to find that validity, we were looking at these square correlations above this diagonal, which contains all of those AVE values that I presented in the previous slides. So these values we wanted them to be lower than their corresponding AVE on the diagonal. And we actually found that that condition was met. So we determined the model had discriminant validity. We were also looking for nomological validity, which basically is saying, are the constructs that should be related by theory significantly related? And we actually found that to be true as well. So with that, we determined that we could move forward with our structural equation modeling. So we were also looking at model fit. We wanted a root mean square error below 0.8, normative fit and comparative fit above 0.9, and we satisfied those requirements. And we found that 72% of the variance in support was explained by the model, and 65% of the variance in positive attitudes was explained by the model, and 37% of variance in negative attitudes was explained by the model. So then we were looking at those structural relationships, okay? Thinking back to the relationships that were shown in that first initial picture of the model. 11 of our 14 hypotheses were supported. And from a visual perspective, we see that actually our model also gives us theoretical support for what we were proposing here. So social exchange theory was supported through the significant effects of perceived community impacts on support. And Weber's theory of formal associative rationality was supported by the significant effects of economic and non-economic factors significantly affecting perceived community impacts and support. So what does this mean for practitioners? Well, specifically in Savannah, we're thinking about social empowerment, which again refers to the ability of a resident to maintain those personal ties with their neighbors. That was actually a problem that many residents were talking about in the public forums. They were talking about this in online through Facebook and Nextdoor, if you're familiar with that app. And basically one of the issues was ghost streets. So there's neighborhoods, particularly in the historic district, which is that most northern district, where you could walk through and all you saw were lock boxes on the door, and you might have one or two permanent residents. And many residents, particularly in the historic district, were upset about this because they felt like there was no sense of community anymore. So around the time that I was doing this research, Savannah was also formally revamping all of its STVR regulations. And to date, the year anniversary for those regulations passed in September, and they've not done any formal regulations as to the effectiveness of that. So it would be important if residents care about the density of STVRs in their street, you would want to make sure that the regulations that were produced in Savannah actually meet the needs of what residents want. Right now, Savannah has a per ward cap. If you're not familiar with what a ward is, it's just a specific geographical scale. And again, there's no evaluation as to whether that was helping ameliorate this effect. And then for psychological empowerment, again, the evaluation of those management strategies would be really helpful in trying to understand, do they help increase residents' pride in their community, even when STVR guests are there? And then from an academic perspective, it provides further evidence that Weber's theory, in addition to social exchange theory, is an appropriate way to understand residents' antecedents for their support. In this year, Modi et al. Produced the first resident attitude study that was looking at residents' support for short-term vacation rentals, but they still were only using social exchange theory. So again, there's a need when research is coming out to address residents' attitudes, we need strong theoretical underpinnings that account for advances in research that have already been done. So the last article of this research was examining the specific type of resident, which is the one that decides to host in their communities. And I wanted to know, well, who are you? Because previous research has really just put hosts in the realm of an entrepreneur. Tessiaria in 2014 and then Bellotti et al. In 2015 began this line of inquiry looking at the motivations for participation. And they found that there were economic and non-economic motivations. However, the theoretical underpinning for that remained in the realm of social exchange theory. And then Bellotti et al.'s work was using Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But the problem with that is that it assumed that there's this process of motivation development that isn't necessarily true for all of entrepreneurs when they start their businesses. So I was using Weber's theory again to be able to capture all of those extrinsic and intrinsic motivations for participation. I was also curious about who these hosts were in terms of a resident identity. And I explored this using McMillan and Chavis's 1986 sense of community framework. And the reason why I wanted to know who these residents are, because if you remember back when I was explaining how residents function in a community, I wanted to know how they perceive the impacts of what they do and what actions they may take, but that would be probably informed by the strength of their residential identity. And so the elements of the residential identity that I was looking for was membership, which is what sorts of communities they belong to in Savannah. I was looking at influence, so points of leadership or political activity that they take. I was looking at integration and fulfillment. So do their neighbors agree with what they're doing? And then I was also looking at emotional closeness. So do they feel that they can still maintain relationships with their neighbors even though they host? And I suggested through this portion of the research that these two identities coalesce to create what Yeager et al. In 2011 described as a sustainable entrepreneur. And this is someone who considers the economic, environmental, and social impacts of their business activity and actually acts upon that. So hosts were solicited using these STVR platforms. These were the most popular and prevalent in Savannah. And I conducted a total of 26 interviews with 28 participants. Interviews lasted between an hour to 2 hours. They were recorded using a digital recorder. And they were transcribed using ExpressScribe. And then the actual coding and thematic analysis was done with Atlas TI.7. And I was using two different frameworks for my coding and thematic analysis. First was Gilgan's 2010 deductive qualitative analysis, which basically allows the researcher to use a framework for your coding. In this case, I was using that tripartite identity of the host. And I was also using what Corbett and Strauss in 2014 explained as grounded theory. So basically allowing for this open coding for themes that might emerge outside of this framework that I was thinking about. And then to ensure accuracy and authenticity of the data, I did member checks with each one of my participants before I moved forward with analysis. So what did we find in terms of the entrepreneurial identity? Well, in terms of these formal motivations, again, this means the economic motivations, we actually found something that Lampinen and Cheshire in 2016 found, which is that formal motivations are nuanced. From this quote here, we actually see a subsistence reason for participating in that this person wants to pay their rent or to make ends meet, which was something that was commonly found among hosts. Another perspective for formal motivations is more about subsidization of a lifestyle or a goal. So in this quote from T23, we see that they were actually investing all their money from their Airbnb into their child's education fund. The substantive motivations of hosts, the most popular one discussed with me was about cultural exchange. Okay, so many hosts talked about meeting people that they would have never met before outside of this platform. And this quote comes from a young woman who identifies as Black and talks about her experience of a woman who came to town for a wedding and how they were able to talk about things like the Black feminist perspective and just being able to be open with each other. And this particular participant explained that they didn't think this could have ever happened without, Airbnb. The second most popular response in terms of substantive motivations was that people really like serving others. They love engaging in hospitality and doing things that they can curate and express their neighborhood. So in this quote, they're talking about, letterpressing a suggestion sheet for their guests, leaving, tokens of appreciation like mini alcohol bottles and chocolates and things like that. And particularly when it came to those binders of information, people went to the extreme to really make sure they had a guidebook that their guests could use. So what we found in general from the entrepreneurial identity is that the formal and substantive rationalities do exist. So it was support for using Weber's theory in that regard. So now looking at the residential identity, thinking about McMillan and Chavis's sense of community framework, I wanted to know, well, what kind of membership do hosts have in their communities? What sorts of groups or communities do you subscribe to? And just as a disclaimer, as we're moving through these 4 elements of the residential identity, many people didn't want to talk to me about how they participated as a resident in the community. They wanted to talk about challenges that they felt to actually maintaining that residential identity. So from a membership perspective, I really love this quote, because this particular host talks about how they accepted the host as sort of an identity that they take on, but they felt like in their previous life, before they ever moved to Savannah, they were many other things in that community, including a musician that would get invited to funerals and weddings and parties, but they felt like that vacation rental identity was overwhelming in Savannah and they couldn't rise above it and actually establish membership to anything else in the city. In terms of influence, hosts really wanted to talk to me about how frustrated they were with the public input process related to STVR regulations. The way that Savannah set up those public stakeholder meetings is that they picked out stakeholders that they wanted to hear from, and those stakeholders were placed at the front of the room, and the residents would sit in the back to listen, and then they had 5 minutes at the end of every meeting to talk, which was really difficult. I sat in a lot of those meetings. There was a lot of people that showed up, so it wasn't quite, I didn't feel like it was even enough time for people to really speak up, but this particular host expressed something that many hosts were upset about, was even just who these stakeholders were. For instance, in this case, they didn't feel that the neighborhood association represented who they were or what they valued. And then from the integration and fulfillment perspective, again, I wanted to know, are your neighbors okay with you hosting? How do they feel about that? And we find in the historic district, which is that very northern end, having the most diversity in terms of perceived acceptance from your neighbors. But for those that were okay, which actually we find in all 3 districts, it was interesting that hosts said that they did things to facilitate that acceptance. So they would do things like water their neighbor's garden or take their trash out or, be sort of this neighborhood crime watch when their neighbors were away. And then hosts explained that in terms of emotional closeness, actually social media platforms came up very often as an issue that they felt in terms of the public debates around short-term vacation rentals. So in this case, this person's talking about a racist remark that they were upset with that they saw on Nextdoor Savannah. So Nextdoor, just for some context, is kind of like Facebook, but it's geographically limited, and you have to sort of show proof that you live in that area to be able to participate. And I actually had access to Nextdoor Savannah, and I was able to see examples of some of what people were describing here. So I've talked about the entrepreneur identity, the residential identity, so I wanted to know how these were coalescing to create a sustainable entrepreneur. So first, I asked hosts, well, do you think there are impacts from your STVR? And so hosts from that triple bottom line perspective did describe economic impacts, such as their guests having a higher multiplier effect in the community. They talked about social impacts where they thought that STVRs reduced crime in particular neighborhoods. And from an environmental perspective, there was a lot of discussions about STVRs using less natural resources than hotels. Well, then I asked them, well, do you do anything about these perceived impacts, essentially? I asked in a little bit less direct way, of course. But from an economic perspective, one of the most popular actions that hosts took was recommending their guests to local businesses. Again, that relates back to that idea about wanting to curate your community and wanting to share it with others. From a social perspective, several hosts talked about how they either wanted to or already do relate their Airbnb or their STVR to philanthropic organizations in Savannah. So in this case, this host talked about how they give a portion of their Airbnb proceeds back to the Boys and Girls Club in Savannah. And they also provide information in that binder in their own STVR about poverty in Savannah to educate their guests. Environmental actions, hosts take a lot, okay? They are really, this was what people were really excited to talk to me about. They talked about all kinds of things about how they engage in recycling, water conservation, eco-friendly cleaning products, alternate transportation information, which includes like bike maps and bus routes, biodegradable products that they bought and put into their STVR for their guests, and energy efficiency measures. This last action here was where hosts actually talked the most about challenges to achieve energy efficiency in their STVRs. So this host explains that in particular, if you're in the historic landmark district, there's historic preservation regulations that prohibit installing panels that can be seen from the main thoroughfare. And so this wasn't the only host that discussed this that said they'd like to see a revision to those regulations where they could actually do that, because if anybody here has been to Savannah in the summer, it's really hot and air conditioning costs are through the roof. And some hosts were showing me their energy bills, and it was just incredible to see that. So what are the implications here? For the city of Savannah and in general, any municipalities that discover that their guests are interested in, their hosts are interested in taking these actions, helping facilitate the incentives that it would take for these actions. So for instance, from an economic perspective, maybe helping hosts partner with those small businesses to create incentive programs for guests to be able to come and patron those businesses. We're also providing educational resources. So while I was in Savannah, I was able to help create a sustainable tourism companion, which basically helps small businesses look for opportunities to reduce their economic, environmental, and social footprint. And I really advocated for STBRs to be included in that guide, and they were, but that has not been disseminated yet to any of the hosts. And then from an academic perspective, again, I think there's a need to move forward from this body of research that's looking at the motivations for participation and to really begin to think about what is this overall identity of the host and how can they be that positive influence, thinking back to that conceptual model, how could they be that catalyst for a rejuvenation trajectory or towards sustainable development in a community? So this research would not have been possible without an interdisciplinary approach, particularly for this first article. And one of my favorite articles that really talks about what interdisciplinary research is by Tress et al. In 2004. And they talk about how interdisciplinary research crosses disciplinary boundaries to create new knowledge and theory. And that's exactly what I was trying to do with this work, using geographical notions of landscapes, ecological systems notions of disease, and how to use innovations or disruptions in these systems. And using the field of tourism and their work and using residents' attitudes and thinking about how destinations develop over time. But Tress et al.'s framework also talks about transdisciplinary research and what that means. And researchers have really debated about, can you really do transdisciplinary research if you're not on a research team? Team science seems to be the way towards transdisciplinary research. But Tress et al. Argue that with the inclusion of non-academic stakeholders throughout the process, you really can achieve to some degree transdisciplinary efforts. And so for this study, what I was doing before I ever even went to Savannah, I conducted 14 pre-study stakeholder interviews, and this crossed everybody from community to industry to government. And I also traveled many times to the city to attend their public stakeholder meetings before I engaged in this process, just so I could really get a feel for the issues that were at hand to make sure that this research was relevant. These stakeholders have been involved the whole time, and they are going to receive the end products of this research. And honestly, especially with the qualitative guide, my questionnaire that I was using, it was really helpful to have met some of these hosts at the public stakeholder meetings, because I was able to adjust as I went, because honestly, it's just what it takes when you're trying to make sure that the research is relevant along the way. So this research has created a big research agenda for me. And as Dr. Boley talked about, I'm already a faculty member at East Carolina University, and I'm really excited to expand upon this research. And I did this sort of from that triple bottom line approach. So from an environmental perspective, I really would like to explore the entrepreneurial opportunities through STBRs, particularly for marginalized groups. So people of color, women. We already see Airbnb partnering with rural entrepreneurial groups in India, for instance, that are targeted towards women, really trying to empower them to be able to own their own businesses in these areas. So I'd like to investigate, especially in an international perspective, if that's actually happening. And then from an environmental perspective, this is something I actually really wanted to do when I first developed this research, but I almost had another degree in engineering to do this. But there's a need to do life cycle analyses of STVRs. Host talked about, what are those natural resource trade-offs? And in 2014, Airbnb did hire a consultant called CleanTech to do this analysis. There's a lot of limitations to that study, and there's a need for academic rigor and actually measuring what these trade-offs are. And then thinking about sort of from this larger landscape approach, I'd like to do a spatial analysis using that survey data that I collected to look at residents' attitudes in relation to many other aspects of the urban landscape. And one way to do this would be using UNESCO's historic urban landscape approach. For those of you that aren't familiar, the goal of this approach is to use processes that range from economic historical processes to cultural values that have changed over time, and to look at how that's all kind of coalesced to create the current landscape that we see today. And it's all about urban conservation and how we can help destinations sustain into the future. So I'd love to be able to integrate some spatial analysis to kind of integrate into that framework. And lastly, I kind of alluded to this. I really thought a lot about how I could get the results of this research to those outside of academia. And first is I'm currently in coordination with the City of Savannah. I'm creating a technical report. The report was to be produced earlier than now, but it was delayed because the city went through some institutional changes. The department that I actually interned with while I was doing this was absorbed by the urban planning department. So there was a lot of change in terms of needs and scope and things like that. So that's still in coordination. And then again, I mentioned this Sustainable Tourism Companion. I'm really excited about this. I'm excited to distribute this to the host. And I also have a copy with me if anybody would be interested in seeing that. And it's also published on City of Savannah's Sustainability Department website. So with that, I would like to thank my chair and my committee members, Dr. Woosnam, Dr. Green, Dr. Goches, Dr. Meredith Welch-Devine. And I'd like to thank all of my funding sources, including the Mornell School of Forestry, the Gerald B. and Charlotte Alexander Saunders Scholarship, the Mr. Terrence and Ms. Sheila Green Nerd Award, the Travel and Tourism Research Association, Tourism Cares, the Center for Integrated Conservation, University of Georgia Graduate School, and the City of Savannah. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my husband and my family and all of my friends.
We'll have a few minutes for public questions, and then we'll break off to more private questions later. So people not at the table, what questions do y'all have for Emily?
Emily, I want to hear a little bit more about this spatial analysis that you want to do. What kind of attributes are you looking at in the neighborhood that you're curious about?
Yeah, so again, I was talking about that historic urban landscape approach. I kind of want to use that as my framework for the indicators that I'd be looking at. So that relates to everything from the built environment, how that's developed over time. I'm looking at everything from green spaces to patterns of, even in Savannah, when you're looking at access to living arrangements and to let's just say there's segregation that still exists, that's present today, and I'd be curious to see how does that all relate to the attitudes that we're perceiving and the desire to support further STVR development. Because actually what I found is I had the opportunity to interview someone who was not in an STVR zone, and they talked about how when STVRs first developed in Savannah, they were a host, but then they were zoned out. And they were upset about that, and they couldn't understand why. And I'd like to answer those questions as to why Savannah chose the zones that they did, and what does that mean, in terms of historic patterns of development in the city. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, sounds cool.
Great work, Emily. I was curious about the sample, like the people you sampled, the hosts. What was the proportion of like live-in hosts versus like second home hosts?
I actually have that information for you. I made extra slides in case anybody wanted to see that. So this is a breakdown of who the hosts were and and how they all differed by different I didn't put this in the main presentation because I didn't know if I would have time. But in terms of owner occupied, more commonly in the historical district, people didn't live in those homes. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that if you're not familiar with the historic district of Savannah, it's intensely populated with tourism activity, right? And so second home ownership makes sense. And as you moved further south, there was more owner occupied listings. And that actually was a huge point of political debate over STVR regulations because they tried to do it initially by owner occupied status. They were trying to do that across all 3 districts. And people were pretty upset about that because it didn't make sense for some districts. Did you have any other questions about the chart itself?
Well, just that.
Let me get out of your way.
I can imagine like some of the identity stuff you talked about differing across the live-in host or the
Absolutely.
people that have so just you can use your own observations or like speculate like how would that change what these people like the way these people engage with
Right.
the bigger community.
No, that's a really important area of research that I think needs to be addressed in the future. But one of the things I'll point out to you, I asked people if they lived in town, and actually only 3 said that they didn't. So that includes even the non-owner occupied. There were people that lived in town that owned, an STVR in a different part of the city. And there was no difference. The reason why I didn't break this down in the results for today's presentation is because even the people that didn't live in town, everybody still presented these elements of the residential identity. The people who lived out of town, I remember talking to this one woman who lives in Atlanta, and she's like, yeah, but I have this home in Savannah and I feel like, that's my home, even though I'm only there for a couple months out of the year. It's still mine because I own a home there and I feel invested into that community. But in general, you're right. I think there is a need to be able to look at segmentation by owner-occupied status for sure. Definitely when we're thinking about actions, right? Like what you would do to minimize your impact, because if you don't live there, you may not perceive, certain impacts as others would if you're actually living in the home.
I'm sure I could talk to you a lot about this. I'm thinking more of like the social cohesion, like that woman that lives in Atlanta, do her neighbors think like she's part of the community or
Yeah, that's a really good point.
but that's really interesting stuff.
No, and I love questions. I thought a lot about that. How could you, even the people who didn't live in town that seem to exhibit elements of residential identity, I don't understand how. But one of the things I briefly mentioned was how the non-owner occupied host frequently talked about doing things to make their neighbors like them or to be happy, right? So if they lived out of town, they might do things like water the garden, take the trash out. And if you don't live in town, maybe you do other things, send a gift basket. I don't know. But it seems like people really try to do things to make their neighbors happy and okay with the fact that they're doing STVRs. I never had a host say, well, I don't care, and I'm just going to do whatever I want. That never came up in any of the discussions.
Do you have any plans, or do you know of anybody else that's looking at maybe so there seems to be some suggested benefits economically, like directing people to local businesses. Is that actually working? Do people actually listen to the hosts, or is there any sort of, are you planning on quantifying?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'm actually in talks with a community in Eastern North Carolina where I'm working at right now to do a visitor profile study of Airbnb guests to ask them specifically these kinds of questions. What do you do when you come and visit? How much money do you think you might have spent at, X, Y, and Z? And you could kind of, ask all those different questions, but there's no research yet that has done any visitor profile studies. That's a great question.
I think we need to get an economist and figure out the actual multiplier rate, because every county has this published multiplier rate. Now, if you spend $1 in Clark County versus Coney County, the way it filters through, the economy is different. But there's never been broken down by tourist category. So if you could actually say, well, this type of tourist, their multiplier is higher because they spend more money locally, then it's actually a much more attractive person to attract than a traditional tourist that, just eating at Outback Steakhouse, staying at Holiday Inn where there's a lot of money leaking out of the community. So try to get an economist to help you when you do that.
Yeah, good point.
Related to that, from a visitor profile standpoint, I was really intrigued by your Venn diagram earlier with the resident versus tourist spaces. I'm wondering if part of that profile of visitors is asking them the reasons that they're coming to a place and whether or not those reasons align with what residents are proud of or landmarks that they themselves also frequent. Given that, at least I think there are probably spaces within cities that residents don't frequent as much, maybe certain more tourist-centric aspects, and whether there's alignment or disagreement between those reasons for living or visiting. I wonder if that could sort of inform the harmoniousness of these interactions.
Absolutely, that's a great point. And there is research that says that people who are traveling using these alternative lodging options prefer those authentic experiences. They prefer the small businesses, but there's actually no research that quantifies that or shows that that's even true. It's just conjecture. That's a great gap in research. You're expanding my research agenda quite a bit. It's good.
Ask a question. Everyone else asked.
Yeah, you better ask
Okay. I'm really interested in like the books that are in the houses or whatever as kind of like a form of performative identity. Like you're performing this identity. Do you have any like to make copies of those books or anything?
I wanted to, but to be quite honest, I have like a list. Maybe like if I went on their profile, I had hosts that like sent me pictures of things that they listed, but the actual books I didn't get copies because they only had like one copy in their house, and I didn't want to take it from them and then risk like losing it and getting it messed up. But yeah, I wish that
The whole form of archival, like you do some kind of
one of the things I thought about was actually following up with participants and, saying, would you mind sharing with me some pictures of those books? Because I think it would be almost like a great qualitative analysis, right? From a visual perspective to see what parts of the neighborhood that they were curating. And as I was thinking about this, a lot of this relates to also how is Savannah marketing itself? So while I was in Savannah, I actually met with Visit Savannah, which is separate from the organization that I joined with. Yes, Joe Marinelli. And Joe and I were talking, and I said, by the way, there are hosts who are curating your neighborhoods, and they're using some of your marketing materials, but not really, and I was like, it might be of interest to reach out to them if I was able to capture that qualitative data and say, this is actually visually what they're marketing and what the content is of that, and that's really important, particularly in those southern ends that I was showing in the Victorian and mid-city districts, because those places are really wanting that authentic tourism experience, and so they are marketing for the smaller places. So, great question.
Great, you got one too? You've heard enough probably.
Good call, good call.
Well, if there's no more questions, I would say, say hello to Emily, grab some more coffee or snacks on the way out.
We can't take this stuff with us, so if you want to take cookies and lemon bars or whatever, please take them with you.
Maybe we'll take a 5-minute break and go to the restroom and come back.
I take a picture of every book and look at it later. I didn't think that I was like, no, as I'm really good.
Sorry to keep track of
Yeah.
I've already got this folder. I started when I did this. It's called Future Resource. Everything has its own. I wanted to tell you about something funny. I have and I had a philosophical debate about what race and things like that.
Whatever the first place
It was just really interesting. You try to hear every good perspectives on what that meant, especially like the course design. And like that was like a huge thing.
And they're really nice that we're doing like that area and Luxembourg, and then we drive from there over to wherever that file is. Yeah. We're there. It's gonna be so fun.
Do you guys do what you're gonna do?
Yeah, so I think
Sounds good.
so this is my question, is like,
It's really based on the moves.
Speaking of, is it recording?
Do you want to?
I think
She gave us a
Okay,
day by
bye,
day,
Darcy. Okay.
like, not even day by day, like,